Hello lovely people, welcome back to Sleep History with Sikandar, and I am so glad you're here with me tonight. Wherever you are right now, in bed, on the sofa, with the lights already low, thank you for spending part of your evening here. I'll take good care of you. Now, picture this. You're sitting in a drawing room. The year is 1873. The fire in the hearth is warm, and the room smells of beeswax candles and something faintly floral, the kind of scent that clings to heavy curtains. There is a candle on the dressing table across the room, small, steady, burning very quietly. You notice it because everything else in this room is the same, still, arranged, just so. You're sitting very straight. You have been sitting very straight for approximately 2 hours. There is a cup of tea on the small table beside you. It has gone cold. You have not mentioned it. Across from you, someone is talking. About what? You have long since stopped tracking the details. You're nodding occasionally. You're smiling occasionally. Your hands are folded neatly in your lap and they are very still. And somewhere behind all of that, behind the posture and the nod and the smile and the cup of cold tea, there is something else. Something you've been carrying since this morning, since before that, possibly since much longer ago than you care to examine too closely. Something with an edge to it, but you won't say so. You can't. Because the thing about being a Victorian woman, a respectable Victorian woman, from a respectable family, in a respectable home, is that you were not, under any circumstances, allowed to be angry. Not visibly, not audibly, not in any way that anyone could see or name or use against you. And here is the part that genuinely surprises people when they first learn it. It wasn't just social pressure. It wasn't merely a matter of good manners. There was a medical diagnosis for women who showed the wrong emotions. There were treatments, formal physician-prescribed treatments, designed to enforce silence. And in many parts of the English-speaking world there were laws, actual statutes on the books, that gave other people the legal authority to remove a woman from her own life if she refused to comply. The anger was always there. That is what I want you to understand tonight. The women we're going to spend this evening with felt everything we feel. They had every reason to be furious, many of them. The question, the really extraordinary and quietly devastating question, was what the world did when the mask slipped even slightly. And the answer is one of the stranger, darker, and more remarkable stories in all of Victorian history. Before we begin, if you haven't already, I'd love it if you subscribed and left a like. It means the world for a small channel, and it helps more people find these stories. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I love knowing who's out there in the quiet with me. Now, let the room go soft. Dim the lights if you can. Let everything that happened today settle somewhere else for a while. It can wait. The week can wait. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench, just a little. There is, somewhere in this story, a candle on a dressing table. Small flame, steady, burning very quietly. Let's begin. There is a poem. It was published in 1854. And its author was an English poet named Coventry Patmore. And the thing you need to understand about this poem, the thing that makes it such a strange and revealing piece of history, is that Patmore did not write it as a social manifesto. He wrote it about his wife. Her name was Emily. She was, by all accounts, a warm and intellectually curious woman whom Patmore loved genuinely and deeply. He wrote the poem as a tribute to her, to the specific quality of her goodness, the way she moved through their home, the sense of safety she created around her. The poem was personal. It was, in essence, a love letter in verse. He called it The Angel in the House. And then, because the Victorian era had a remarkable talent for taking something personal and inflating it into a universal law, the poem was read by everyone. It was taught in schools, quoted in sermons, referenced in medical journals, reprinted in etiquette manuals and conduct books and women's magazines. By the 1860s and 1870s, The Angel in the House was not merely a poem. It was a cultural prescription, a description of what a woman was, or rather what a woman ought to be, stated as if it were simply a fact of nature, which, to be entirely fair to Patmore, was not what he intended. Probably, the ideal the poem described was this: a woman was, at her best, selfless, passive, pure, and devoted entirely to the comfort and happiness of those around her. She had no needs of her own that superseded those of her husband and family. She was the moral centre of the home, its spiritual foundation, and that meant she had to remain, at all times, untroubled, unthreatening, undisturbed. She was not supposed to want things loudly. She was not supposed to disagree in a way that was visible. And she was absolutely, categorically not supposed to be angry. Now here is the myth bust, and I think it's an important one, because most people, when they consider Victorian expectations of women, assume the rules were about manners, about surface behaviour, about the social requirement to be polite in public, and yes, that was real. But the angel ideal went considerably deeper than that. It wasn't just a performance the world expected. It was supposed to be her actual nature. The logic ran like this: a truly good woman, a truly womanly woman, would not feel anger. She would feel compassion, patience, understanding. If she felt anger, that was evidence that something in her was broken, not that the situation around her was unjust, not that she had a legitimate grievance. The anger itself was the problem. It was a sign that she had failed at being what she was supposed to be. Think about what that means for a moment. It doesn't just silence the emotion, it relocates the blame. The woman who was furious about her husband's cruelty, or her lack of legal rights, or the sheer grinding exhaustion of managing an entire household with no recognition and very little help. She wasn't seen as someone with a complaint worth addressing. She was seen as someone who lacked the feminine virtue that would allow her to accept a situation with grace. The anger was her flaw, not the situation. Her. That is the architecture of the angel in the house ideal, and it is a quietly efficient piece of social engineering, if we're using efficient to mean effective rather than just, and it spread everywhere. By the 1860s, you could find this ideal operating in Britain, in America, in Australia, and across the English-speaking empire. It wasn't called a law. It didn't need to be. It was something more durable than a law. It was a shared assumption about what a good woman fundamentally was, and therefore what an angry woman fundamentally was not. Coventry Patmore published the 4 instalments of the poem between 1854 and 1862. His wife Emily, the actual woman who inspired all of it, the real and specific human being behind the ideal, died in 1862. She was 43 years old. He married again 2 years later. There's something in that I find quietly worth pausing on. The Angel in the House was written as a tribute to one particular woman. The particular woman died, and the ideal outlasted her by decades, and then by generations, and it was still being cited in advice columns and quoted in women's magazines well into the 1890s and beyond. The ideal was always more durable than the women it was supposed to describe, and the mechanisms by which it spread are worth understanding, because they explain how a personal love poem achieved the cultural reach of a public policy. Schools were one primary channel. By the 1860s and 1870s, the content of girls' education in the fee-paying schools for middle-class girls and in the Sunday schools that reached working-class children included, directly or indirectly, the values encoded in the angel ideal. A girl was taught to be modest, patient, self-effacing, and devoted. She was taught that intellectual ambition, in its more conspicuous forms, was unbecoming, that leadership was for men, that her role was to support, encourage, and sustain, not to initiate, dominate, or compete. She was also taught, and this is where it becomes particularly interesting, that these qualities were not merely social expectations, they were described as natural, as the expression of genuine femininity. A truly womanly woman would want to be these things, would feel most herself when she was enacting them. The suppression in this framing was not external. It was internal, self-imposed, the product of a nature that had been correctly understood and given appropriate expression. Churches reinforced this. The Victorian Church, across denominations with some variation, drew on a long tradition of associating femininity with spiritual virtue, and spiritual virtue with the qualities the angel embodied. A sermon that praised patient endurance, selfless service, and emotional restraint was praising exactly the emotional profile the angel demanded. The sacred and the social endorsed each other. Medical literature completed the triangle. By the mid-century, the scientific vocabulary was available, nervous systems, constitutions, temperaments, to dress the social prescription in physiological language. Women were not merely expected to be calm, they were constitutionally suited to calmness. Their nervous systems required it. The medical establishment had published it. The church had blessed it. The school had taught it. The drawing room performed it, and then it crossed the Atlantic. The angel in the house arrived in America with some modifications. The specific class context was different. American society was less rigidly hierarchical, and the middle class was larger and more diverse. But the core emotional prescription was the same, and it found an equally receptive audience. American etiquette literature of the mid-century is saturated with the same vocabulary. The self-effacing wife, the patient mother, the woman whose emotional stability is the moral foundation of the family. By the time Elizabeth Packard was taken from her home in 1860, by the time Charlotte Perkins Gilman lay in her rescue bed in 1887, the ideal had been operating on both sides of the Atlantic for more than 30 years. An entire generation of women had grown up inside it, had been taught to see it as nature, had taught their daughters the same. The poem was never the whole story. It was the seed. The institutions, the school, the church, the medical profession, the law, were the soil. And once all four were operating simultaneously, the ideal became self-sustaining. It no longer needed Coventry Patmore or any individual advocate. It needed only the everyday operation of four interlocking systems, schools that taught modesty, churches that praised endurance, doctors who diagnosed inconvenience, laws that gave husbands legal authority over their wives' freedom. Each institution reinforced the others. The social expectation had medical backing. The medical theory had legal weight. The legal structure had moral sanction from the church. And the church taught the girls who would grow up to run the households where all of it played out daily, in the evenings and the morning calls and the 3-draft letters and the anger that had nowhere to go. That is how a love poem became a cage, slowly, institutionally, with the best of intentions and the worst of results. But where exactly did that leave a Victorian woman in her actual daily life? sitting in her actual drawing room with her actual cup of cold tea, trying to navigate the space between what she felt and what she was permitted to express. The answer turns out to be in a very precisely calibrated kind of silence. Because the angel ideal didn't just say don't be angry, it said be so thoroughly devoted to the happiness of others that you genuinely don't have time or occasion to feel anger at all. Your entire emotional economy should be running at a surplus of warmth and patience, with nothing left over for grievance, and if you did feel something sharp and inconvenient, well, there were ways to handle that too. Not your ways, theirs. There were rules. Very specific rules about how the emotional interior of a respectable woman was supposed to function, and how her exterior was supposed to look, and what happened when the two came apart. Most of those rules were never written down. The ones that were written down were disguised as something else entirely, as advice about deportment, about graciousness, about being a pleasant companion for others. But underneath the advice was a clear and steady message. Feel what we tell you to feel. Show only what we permit you to show. And if the gap between those two things becomes unbearable, find a way to bear it anyway. The drawing room is warm. The candle on the dressing table is still burning. Your hands are folded in your lap. What you do with all of that, with the cold tea and the folded hands and the thing behind the smile, is the story we're really telling tonight. To understand it, you have to understand the particular double standard at the heart of the Victorian emotional world. And it is, once you see it clearly, one of the more remarkable double standards in the history of emotional regulation. Male anger in the Victorian era had a name, it had a shape. It was called righteous indignation, and it was considered, in the right circumstances, a sign of moral seriousness. A man who grew visibly angry at an injustice, who raised his voice, struck the table, declared that something was simply not acceptable, was demonstrating that he cared, that he was a man of principle, that he understood the difference between right and wrong and felt it in his bones. There were limits, of course. A gentleman didn't brawl in the street. He didn't shout at dinner parties. But the anger itself, the fact of it, the existence of it as an emotion, was not a problem. It was practically a virtue. Hot anger, passionate anger. The kind that comes from caring too much about something real. Female anger was described in the medical and social literature of the same period as something else entirely. It was called cold, not hot and righteous. Cold, deceptive, calculating, dangerously controlled. The very qualities that made male anger seem honest and morally legible, the immediacy of it, the visibility, were the qualities that made female anger seem threatening. A woman who showed anger wasn't demonstrating moral seriousness. She was demonstrating instability, or worse, cunning. The same emotion, experienced by two different people in similar circumstances, was categorized as completely different things. One was a man's right, one was a woman's failing, and this wasn't a fringe view held by a handful of cranks. It was mainstream. You could find it in medical textbooks and in sermons and in the kinds of etiquette manuals that sat on the drawing room shelves of every respectable household in Britain and America. Female anger was pathological, a symptom, a crack in the surface that revealed something wrong with what was underneath. Now, you might be wondering, how did a Victorian woman actually live inside this? Not as an abstract idea, but as a daily reality. What did it feel like from the inside to carry an emotion that the entire surrounding culture had decided was evidence of your own deficiency? The answer, from the diaries and letters that survive, is that most women learn to transform it. Anger became industry. It became the frenetic energy of an extremely well-organised household, where every surface was polished and every meal was perfectly timed, and every visitor was received with the appearance of total serenity. If you've ever met someone who keeps their home immaculate in a way that has a faint undertone of intensity to it, this is not a new phenomenon. Anger became concern. A Victorian woman who felt fury at her husband's behaviour could redirect it, with some effort, into pointed and meticulous care for his comfort. The anger didn't disappear. It just went somewhere useful, where it could pass as love. Anger became silence, a very specific kind of silence, not the soft, drowsy quiet of a person at rest, but the tight, controlled silence of a person who has made a decision not to speak, and who is holding that decision very carefully, the way you hold a full glass when you know the floor is uneven. And sometimes, in the privacy of a journal, in the dark hours of a night when the house was quiet, anger became words, private ones, words written in a hand so small they could barely be read, and sometimes crossed out, and sometimes written over themselves so that even the author couldn't quite retrieve what she had said. The drawing room in 1873 is still there, if you close your eyes. The fire, the arrangement, the posture, and somewhere behind all of it, something that was never given a name it was allowed to keep. The candle is still burning on the dressing table, the tea is still cold. Let's go a little deeper. The poem spread because it answered a need, not the need of women, but the need of a society that was changing fast and wanted desperately to believe that some things stayed fixed. The 19th century was a time of enormous disruption, industrialization, urbanization, the collapse of old class certainties, cities filling with people who had no roots in them, the traditional structures of village life, of extended family, of the rhythms of agricultural seasons, all of it dissolving into something louder and more uncertain. And in the middle of all that uncertainty, the Victorian home was held up as the one stable thing, the one place that was ordered, clean, morally coherent, protected from the chaos outside. A refuge. And who made it a refuge? Who held that order together? The woman, the angel. Which meant that the woman's emotional stability wasn't just a personal virtue, it was a social necessity. If she was calm and patient and unangered, the home was safe. If she was not, if she was frustrated or furious or inconveniently human, then the refuge failed. And without the refuge, what was there? This is why female anger felt so threatening to the Victorian world in a way that goes beyond mere social propriety. It wasn't just about manners, it was about what they believed the family and therefore civilization rested on. A woman's anger was not simply unpleasant. It was, in the logic of the era, a structural failure, like a crack in a load-bearing wall. And so, the weight of an entire social order and the weight of what home was supposed to mean, what motherhood was supposed to mean, what femininity was supposed to mean, got placed quietly and without discussion onto the shoulders of every woman who sat in a drawing room and decided not to say what she was actually thinking. That is a great deal of weight to carry, silently, with your hands folded in your lap. But the rules that governed that silence were not general. They were specific, granular, and you need to understand them from the inside to understand what a Victorian woman's daily life actually looked like, what she was navigating every single morning when she came downstairs, what she was calculating at every dinner table, at every morning call, at every family gathering. The rules were not written in a single place. They lived in etiquette manuals and conduct books, and the accumulated expectations of the people around you, but they were consistent enough that you could learn them, and once learned, they were the kind of rules that became invisible, not because they weren't there, but because you stopped being able to see anything else. Picture yourself stepping into that world, properly. Not as a tourist looking at it from outside, but as a woman living it. It is a Tuesday morning in 1878. You're in your own home. You wake up, and immediately, before you've had a cup of tea, before you've had a moment of genuine quiet in your own head, the calculations begin. Your husband said something last night, at dinner, in front of his colleague, in a tone that made you go very still, that you are still thinking about. It was dismissive. It was done in that particular way that pretends to be jovial, so that if you respond to it, you're the one who can't take a joke. You're still thinking about it. But you come downstairs. You greet the cook. You discuss the day's meals with a warmth you are manufacturing from scratch at 7 in the morning. You arrange the flowers in the hallway because one of them has started to droop, and drooping flowers in a hallway are, for reasons you have never questioned, a personal failure. Then the children come down, and there are small disasters that need managing. A missing shoe, a minor injustice between siblings, a lesson that was not prepared, a tear that needs drying. You manage all of it. You manage it patiently. You manage it with a gentleness that cost you something you can't quite name. By 9 o'clock in the morning you have already performed. Performed is the right word. Patience approximately 15 times. The etiquette manuals of the Victorian era were not subtle about any of this. They prescribed emotional restraint in granular, specific detail. A lady did not raise her voice. She did not speak sharply to servants, even when a servant had done something genuinely irritating. She did not display visible impatience at the dinner table, even when the conversation bored her to a state approaching physical pain. She did not allow herself to show irritation at social calls, no matter how long those calls ran, no matter how tedious the company, no matter how much else she had to do that afternoon. She also, and this is the part the manuals were quite earnest about, didn't argue. Not openly, not visibly. A disagreement with her husband was to be handled privately, gently, deferentially, with the understanding that the final decision was his, and that she had expressed her view as a contribution rather than as a challenge to his authority. The difference between those two things, a contribution and a challenge, was entirely in the tone. The same words delivered with the wrong inflection could transform a gentle observation into an act of domestic warfare, and Victorian women knew this. They learned it early, and they never forgot it. There were physical signs in period literature and in diary accounts that people recognized as evidence of suppressed female anger, a certain set to the jaw, a particular way of going very quiet and very still, suddenly and completely, like a room from which all the air has been removed, the white-knuckled grip on the edge of a table, the too-controlled smile that stretched a fraction wider than anything genuine. Observers noticed these things. They were described in novels. They were referenced in household management guides, delicately, as unfortunate states that a well-governed woman would learn to avoid displaying. Note that word, displaying, not feeling, not experiencing, not even, really, having, displaying. The goal was not the absence of anger. The goal was the absence of its visibility, which is, if you pause to think about it, a considerably more difficult achievement. You can train yourself not to shout. You cannot always train your jaw not to tighten, or your hands not to know what they know, or your eyes not to do the thing they do in the second before you decide to let it go. Some women were very good at this, extraordinarily good, so good that the anger had nowhere to go at all, and eventually made itself known through other channels: headaches, fatigue, the long, exhausting Victorian phenomenon of nerves that seemed to afflict so many otherwise apparently healthy women. Some were less good at it, and for those women, the consequences of showing the wrong emotion in the wrong place at the wrong time could be swift and lasting, and, as we'll come to, formally medical. But that comes later. For now, stay in the drawing room. The afternoon light is coming through the curtains. There's a faint smell of wood smoke, and something that might be lavender. The candle on the dressing table has been burning since morning, and it's noticeably shorter now than it was. You're sitting at your writing desk composing a letter to your sister. You've been composing it for 3 drafts. In the first draft, you said what you actually thought. In the second draft, you said a softened version of it. In the third draft, which is the one you'll actually send, you've said almost nothing of the kind at all, but the care with which you didn't say it is, to anyone who knows how to read between the lines, entirely legible. She'll understand. That is the remarkable thing. She will understand completely, because she has her own unsent first drafts. There was, under the surface of Victorian respectable life, an entire parallel language of the not quite said. Not quite said in letters, not quite said in the careful pauses in conversation, not quite said in the way a woman rose from her chair when her husband entered the room, the small controlled economies of motion that could carry, if you looked carefully, an entire interior weather system. Victorian women communicated a great deal across that silence. They just weren't supposed to. And as long as it stayed in the silence, as long as it remained private, internal, converted into industry and concern and the spotless management of a spotless home, it was tolerated, quietly, with some sympathy from the women who knew, and with cheerful obliviousness from everyone else. But the moment it broke the surface, the moment it became visible, audible, undeniable, the world had systems for that too. The social systems were just the beginning. The medical profession had ideas, and the legal world had tools. What happened to a Victorian woman when her anger finally, unavoidably showed? That is where this story becomes considerably more interesting. But before we get there, let's stay a while longer in the ordinary world, because the most important part of how the suppression worked was not the formal machinery, the diagnosis, the institution, the law. It was the fact that the suppression was taught, passed down, embedded in the relationship between mothers and daughters so deeply that it stopped feeling like a rule and started feeling like nature. You need to understand the marriage market to understand this, not as a romantic institution, but as an economic one, because that is what it was in the Victorian middle and upper classes, and everyone who participated in it knew it, even when they chose not to say so directly. A young woman's primary asset in that market was her reputation, not her intelligence, though that might be mentioned in polite conversation, not her capabilities, though those would be assessed, her reputation, her character, the impression she made, whether she was generally agreed upon by the people who mattered to be pleasant, manageable, gracious, and reliably untroubling. This meant that a young woman who displayed visible anger, who argued in drawing rooms, who expressed opinions that created friction, who failed to maintain the particular quality of cheerful agreeableness that the marriage market rewarded, was, in a very practical financial sense, damaging her prospects. And her mother knew this. Her mother had navigated this herself, and had survived it, and had built a life within it. And the most practical thing her mother could do for her the most loving thing in the vocabulary of that world was to teach her how to survive it too. So the rules were taught, not as rules, as common sense, as good manners, as the unremarkable guidance of a mother who wanted her daughter to be happy in the particular way that happiness was available within those constraints. Don't raise your voice, my dear. People will think you excitable. A lady doesn't argue. She discusses. There is a difference, and it matters. If you feel strongly about something, feel it privately. The drawing room is not the place. These instructions were not given cruelly in most cases. They were given from experience, from genuine hard-won knowledge of how the system worked and what it cost to fight it. The women who taught the rules had often paid the price of not knowing them, or of learning them too late, and they did not want that cost for their daughters, which is one of the ways the suppression perpetuated itself across generations, not through malice, through love, through the practical, affectionate wisdom of women who had mastered the art of living within walls they hadn't built and couldn't move, and who were teaching their daughters the same art as a form of protection. The daughter learned. She was in most cases a quick learner, because the consequences of not learning were visible around her, in the woman at church who was spoken of in a particular tone, in the girl whose season had not gone well, and whose family's expression when they discussed her future had a careful quality to it. She learned to sit straight. She learned to nod. She learned the specific temperature of a smile that was warm enough to be engaging but controlled enough to be safe. She learned the three-draft letter, and then, in time, she had daughters of her own. Picture an evening in that world. Not the drawing room this time, the evening room, the parlour after dinner, when the children have been sent to bed and the guests have gone and it is just the household settling. The fire has burned down somewhat from its earlier height. The room smells of it, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of the beeswax candles on the mantelpiece, and something floral from the arrangement on the side table. Outside it is dark, and the sounds from the street have diminished to occasional footsteps and the distant rhythm of horses on cobblestones. Your husband is reading. He has been reading for the better part of an hour, and he is entirely elsewhere, present in the room physically, but elsewhere in every way that matters. You have a piece of needlework in your hands. You're not particularly interested in the needlework. You've never been particularly interested in needlework. But your hands need to be doing something, and this is the available thing. Your mind, in the meantime, is doing what it always does in these quiet hours, covering ground, running over the day, the conversation at dinner that went slightly wrong in a way you haven't quite identified yet, the letter from your sister that arrived this morning and that you've read 3 times and still not quite understood, the decision your husband made last week without consulting you that affects the household in ways he hasn't asked about and probably won't. The fire crackles once, softly, and settles. You don't say any of this. The room is pleasant. The evening is pleasant. Your husband is content with his book, and the children are asleep, and it would be unnecessary. It would be, in the particular vocabulary of your domestic world, a kind of disruption, to bring any of it into the room, so you don't. You sit in the warmth of the fire and the light of the candles, and you work the needle through the fabric, in and out, and the thoughts keep moving behind your composed expression like weather behind glass. This is the evening that happens in thousands of Victorian homes, on thousands of evenings, across the decades of the reign. This specific and unremarkable silence, this specific and unremarkable carrying. The Victorian language around women's emotional experience was remarkably well developed, for a language dedicated to not talking about something directly. It had euphemisms for every register of suppressed feeling. A woman who was struggling was not quite herself. A woman who was angry was out of sorts. A woman who was severely depressed was suffering from her nerves. A woman who had broken under the accumulated weight of a life lived entirely in service of other people's comfort was in a delicate state. These phrases were not ironic. They were used sincerely by people who believed they were describing something real, a genuine fragility in the female constitution that needed to be managed carefully. The euphemism and the belief were intertwined. The language shaped the perception, and the perception shaped the language. And somewhere underneath both of them, actual women were experiencing actual things that neither the language nor the perception had any interest in accurately describing. The woman, not quite herself, might be grieving. She might be exhausted. She might be furious. She might be discovering somewhere around her 35th year that the life she had constructed with such care and competence was not the life she had actually wanted, and that this discovery had arrived far too late to do much about. The phrase, not quite herself, suggested that the real self was the calm, pleasant, well-managed version, and that whatever was currently presenting itself was a temporary deviation from the norm. The anger, the grief, the exhaustion, those were the deviation. The performance was the truth. Here is what nobody tells you about the performance, though. It was exhausting. Not in the way that hard physical labour is exhausting, though it had physical dimensions in the way that sustained tension always does. It was exhausting in the way that any long-term performance is exhausting. The way that always being careful costs more than anyone who isn't doing it can easily understand. Women wrote about this exhaustion in the private spaces where they could. The diaries, the trusted letters, the characters in novels who sat in drawing rooms and found the conversation simultaneously inescapable and meaningless. Virginia Woolf, writing at the very end of the period we're discussing, said something about the angel in the house that captures it precisely. She described the angel as the ideal that she, Woolf, had to kill in order to write anything honest at all. The angel, she said, was always whispering, "Be sympathetic, be tender, flatter, deceive, use all the arts and wiles." And whenever Woolf tried to write anything with a critical edge, or an opinion, or a direct observation about something true and uncomfortable, the angel tried to stop her. The angel did not want honesty. The angel wanted grace. And the world around them had its own rituals for making sure they kept knowing it. The rules didn't only operate inside the home. They operated, perhaps most visibly, most rigorously, in the ritual of the morning call. If you were a middle-class Victorian woman, you made calls. This was not optional. It was a system of social maintenance as formal and as necessary as paying your taxes, and considerably more time-consuming. The morning call, which, despite its name, typically happened in the afternoon, because Victorian naming conventions had their own logic, was a visit of somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes to the home of an acquaintance, friend, or social superior. You arrived at the right time. You sat in the right chair. You said the right things. The right things were pleasant observations about the weather, inquiries after the health of family members, brief and positive accounts of recent events in your own life. The wrong things were anything real, anything that required genuine engagement with the actual state of your interior, anything that might leave you feeling less lonely than when you arrived. The call had a script, not a literal one, but everyone knew it, the way everyone knows the choreography of a social interaction that has been performed 10,000 times. And if something in you, some flicker of genuine emotion pushed against that script, the consequences were swift and entirely social. A woman who seemed difficult in company was noted. A woman who expressed an opinion too forcefully was noticed, and the noticing was not kind. A woman who failed to manage her visible emotional state with the expected grace, who let something slip in her voice, or her expression, or the slightly too abrupt way she set down her cup, would find in the weeks that followed that fewer calls were returned, that invitations arrived less frequently, that the warm, social fabric of her life, which was also her primary source of companionship and stimulation, began to thin. Social exclusion in the Victorian era was not a metaphor. It was a mechanism. It was one of the primary tools by which the emotional rules were enforced, and it worked because it attacked the one resource a respectable middle-class woman genuinely had. Her social standing. You might push back. You might think, well, surely a woman with genuine grievances was more concerned with justice than with morning calls. But that gets the priorities backwards. Her social standing was not a vanity. It was her security, her ability to make a good match for her daughters, her husband's reputation, her family's place in the local hierarchy, her access to the networks through which small favours, information, and assistance moved. Lose the social standing, and you lost all of that. And so the morning call was performed, the script was followed, the emotion was managed, or swallowed, or redirected into the precise arrangement of the biscuits on the plate, and the three-draft letter on the writing desk, and the angle of the flowers in the hallway vase. And life went on, orderly and well-organised and quietly airless. There were women who managed this beautifully for their entire adult lives, who found, genuinely, that the emotional discipline required produced something like peace, the peace of a person who has stopped fighting their circumstances and made something interesting out of them instead. There were women who managed it less well, and who felt the weight of it every single day, and who found the journals and the letters and the small private rebellions insufficient, and who eventually could not manage it at all. And then there were the women who, for one reason or another, because of genuine mental suffering, or because of legitimate grievance, or simply because they were unlucky enough to have the wrong audience on the wrong day, let their anger become visible, undeniably, irretrievably visible. For those women, the Victorian world had something more formal than social exclusion waiting, something considerably more clinical. The medical profession of the 19th century was not shy about women's emotions. It had theories, detailed ones, confident ones, and those theories had a name. Hysteria is one of the oldest medical diagnoses in recorded history. The ancient Greeks believed it was caused by the uterus, the Greek word for which was hystera, wandering through the body when it was unsatisfied or underoccupied, causing chaos as it went. This is where the word hysteria comes from, the wandering womb. By the Victorian era, no respectable physician still believed in the wandering uterus theory, but the diagnosis had survived the death of its original explanation and simply acquired new ones, because it was, as a category, too socially useful to abandon. In the 19th century, hysteria became something new. It became an umbrella, a catch-all, a diagnosis that could be applied to almost any behaviour that male-dominated medicine found inconvenient, inexplicable, or simply too complicated to address properly. The list of hysteria symptoms catalogued in the work of one influential Victorian physician ran to 75 entries. 75. And the author, to his credit, noted that even this was not exhaustive. The list included anxiety, irritability, insomnia, fainting, paralysis, depression, excessive emotion, which, given that depression was also on the list, covered both having too much feeling and having not enough. It included excessive reading. It included grief. It included religious enthusiasm. It included having opinions that were inconvenient to the people around you. Think about what that list means for a moment. If you were sad, you might have hysteria. If you were angry, you might have hysteria. If you read too many novels, you might have hysteria. If you believed in God with somewhat more fervour than was considered tasteful, you might have hysteria. If you disagreed with your husband's decisions or expressed views of your own with any particular force, you might have hysteria. It was, as diagnoses go, impressively flexible. What it was not in the modern sense was a disease. It was a category, a filing system for the behaviour of women that medicine didn't understand and society didn't want to accommodate, and it served a very specific social function. It took what might otherwise look like a legitimate complaint, a woman who was exhausted or isolated or treated unfairly or suffering from genuine grief, and reframed it. It converted her from a person with a grievance into a patient with a condition. And that distinction mattered enormously, because a person with a grievance deserved to be heard. A patient with a condition deserved to be treated. The treatment was not listening. Let me drop a comment prompt in here, because I think this moment deserves it. If you knew any of this before tonight, I want to hear from you in the comments. And if you didn't, that's the whole point of why we're here. Carrying on. The diagnosis of hysteria converted female anger, converted female any inconvenient emotion, into a medical problem. And once it was a medical problem, it belonged to the doctors. The woman's own interpretation of her experience became irrelevant. What mattered now was the physician's interpretation, and the physician, in the 19th century, was virtually always a man. The woman who was furious about her husband's control over her finances now had nervous irritability. The woman who was heartbroken and frightened after losing a child was exhibiting excessive grief. The woman who refused to perform the domestic role expected of her was displaying disordered affect. Every legitimate response to a real situation, translated by the machinery of the 19th century medicine into a symptom of something wrong with her. This is the moment in the story where the system that began as a social expectation, be calm, be pleasant, manage your emotions, became something with formal institutional weight behind it. The drawing room rule was enforced by social consequence. The medical diagnosis was enforced by something considerably more powerful, the authority of science. The authority of men with qualifications, who had studied at respected institutions, who wrote papers in journals, who made pronouncements in confident, measured, professional language. And that authority could do something that social exclusion could not. It could remove a woman from her own life, completely, formally, without her consent. And in the middle of all of this, in the middle of the diagnosis and the authority and the institutional weight of it, there was a treatment waiting, a specific, prescribed, physician-endorsed treatment for the nervous, the emotional, the inconveniently feeling Victorian woman, and it is one of the more remarkable things the 19th century produced. But first, let's stay a moment longer with the diagnosis itself, because it deserves the attention. 75 symptoms is a number that sounds almost comic from where we're standing, but its implications were anything but. When a diagnosis has 75 possible presentations, it essentially has no meaningful boundary at all. There is no behaviour that cannot, with the right framing, become a symptom. And that boundlessness was not an accident. It was a feature. The the flexibility of the hysteria diagnosis was what made it so useful, because what it was really diagnosing was not a medical condition. It was deviation. Any deviation, any departure from the narrow emotional script that respectable Victorian femininity demanded. By the middle of the 19th century, the numbers told a quiet and startling story. Female admissions to asylums across Britain had begun, in many institutions, to outpace male admissions. Women were being committed in growing numbers, not only for obvious mental illness, but for the broader, softer, more flexible category of things that fell under the umbrella of nervous disorders and hysteria. The admission records of the period are extraordinary documents if you have the stomach for them. They read like a catalogue of the ordinary, not the dramatic, the ordinary. One American institution, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Virginia, maintained records of reasons given for female admissions throughout the 19th century. The list includes, without irony or apparent awareness of how it would read to later eyes, imaginary female trouble, bad company, laziness, novel reading, grief, religious enthusiasm, domestic trouble. Domestic trouble, that's the phrase, not domestic violence. Not being trapped in an abusive situation with no legal recourse. Domestic trouble, a category so broad it could swallow almost anything. You might have thought, reading that list, what happened to these women? Were they genuinely suffering from something that warranted institutional care? Were they being removed from their homes for purely political reasons? The honest answer is both and neither, and the distinction often didn't matter, because the category of who deserved to be in an asylum was shaped entirely by the people doing the diagnosing. A woman in genuine and serious mental distress might receive exactly the same admission note as a woman who had simply had an argument with her husband in front of the wrong witnesses. The record didn't distinguish between them. The institution didn't either. What happened to a family's reputation when a wife or daughter was committed to an asylum was complicated. There was stigma, but there was also for families dealing with a woman who wouldn't conform, or who was too inconvenient, or whose behaviour threatened the social standing of those around her. There was relief, a clinical explanation, a medical narrative, nothing scandalous, just nerves. This is what the hysteria diagnosis made possible. It provided cover, a socially acceptable physician-endorsed story to tell about why this particular woman was no longer present at the breakfast table. The medical establishment had opinions about all of this. Those opinions were stated in peer-reviewed language, in well-bound journals, at professional conferences, with tremendous confidence. They were almost entirely wrong, but they were so authoritatively wrong that it took decades for anyone in a position to act on them to notice. And while that was happening, while the diagnosis was being applied and refined and expanded and applied again, there were women inside asylums who did not belong there, who had said something inconvenient, or felt something too visibly, or refused a role that was consuming them, and who are now sitting in a ward being observed, having their behaviour interpreted by people with no interest in understanding what had actually happened to them. That detail, the detail of the ward, the observation, the institutional patience of it, I find genuinely difficult to sit with. Not for abstract reasons, but because the gap between what these women were experiencing and what was being said about them was so vast and so precisely constructed, and so thoroughly maintained by institutions that considered themselves caring. There's something quietly devastating in that, in the care that made the trap so complete. Let's stay inside that for a moment, because the Victorian asylum is easy to imagine in the dramatic version. The Gothic architecture, the damp corridors, the theatrical suffering. That version exists and it is not entirely wrong, but it misses the particular quality of what the more ordinary institutions were actually like, and what made them so effective as a tool of suppression. Most Victorian asylums for the middle-class patient were not particularly dramatic. They were orderly, clean, often set in pleasant grounds. The staff were, in many cases, people who genuinely believed in the work they were doing and who applied to it a kind of institutional kindness, the kindness of the schedule, the routine, the managed environment. You woke at a certain time, you ate at a certain time, your activities were structured, supervised, recorded. Everything about your behaviour was observed, not maliciously, but systematically, as data, as evidence, in an ongoing case being built by people who'd already decided what the verdict was. This is what made it so difficult to resist. A woman who protested her confinement was demonstrating exactly the kind of disordered behaviour that had supposedly placed her there. A woman who was calm and cooperative was progressing well. A woman who argued, or wept, or refused to participate in the activities offered. She was providing more evidence for the original diagnosis. The system had no exit condition that the inmate could control. The only way to be declared recovered was to be so thoroughly managed that you ceased to present as anything other than what the institution expected a recovered woman to look like: quiet, cooperative, no longer in disagreement, which was, of course, the original requirement, the one that had started the whole thing. The women who were committed for expressing inconvenient opinions, or for emotional states that their families found unmanageable, or for the simple fact of refusing to perform happiness they did not feel. Those women were placed in an environment that was designed to produce, eventually, either genuine compliant calm or the appearance of it, and the appearance was sufficient. The appearance was all the institution needed to write "recovered" in the notes and send her home. Home to the situation that had produced the original complaint, changed now in one of two directions: either genuinely worn down, the resistance ground out of her by the slow institutional pressure of the schedule and the observation and the diagnosis, or simply smarter about concealment, more careful about where the anger showed. Either way, the system had achieved its goal. You might be wondering, were there no voices inside the medical establishment that objected to any of this? That found the 68-year-old widow committed for grief and thought, this is not right? There were a few. And their protests were noted and published and mostly not acted upon, because the social function the system served was too valuable to the people in a position to change it. The protests exist in the historical record. They were real. They were insufficient. The medical-legal complex that enabled Victorian women's emotional suppression was not a conspiracy. It did not require anyone to be deliberately cruel, or deliberately dishonest, or deliberately working against the interests of the women caught inside it. It required only that enough people, physicians, husbands, family members, legislators, judges, found the system convenient, and were not sufficiently troubled by its cost to do the work of changing it. That is, in many ways, a more disturbing story than deliberate malice would be. Deliberate malice can be confronted. Convenient indifference is harder to address, because it doesn't know it's doing anything wrong. It considers itself reasonable. It has paperwork, and the women inside the system had no paperwork at all. They had their own testimony, which was, by definition, the testimony of someone unreliable. The circular logic held. The records were written by the people doing the confining, about the people being confined. The confined person's account of her own experience was a symptom to be managed, not a document to be believed. This is the thing that Elizabeth Packard fought so hard in her years of lobbying after the 7-minute trial, not just the specific law about married women in Illinois, but the underlying assumption that had made the law possible, that a woman's testimony about her own mental state was less credible than a physician's assessment of it, that the observer's account was more real than the experienced one. She argued in the language available to her in the 1860s and 1870s that this was not a reasonable basis for law, that a person's perception of their own experience was a legitimate source of evidence about that experience, that the circularity of a system in which disagreement was a symptom of the condition it was used to diagnose was not justice. It was a trap. She was right. It took decades and considerable legal and political effort from many people before the law slowly, reluctantly agreed with her. In the meantime, the ordinary mechanisms continued. The morning calls were made, the 3 draft letters were written, the evening parlours were quiet, the needlework moved, the thoughts moved behind composed faces like weather behind glass, and the women who knew, who had always known, found their ways. Some of them found their ways through the formal channels that were beginning, slowly, to open. The universities, which began admitting women to lectures in the 1860s and 1870s, and to degrees in the decades following. The medical profession itself, which saw its first qualified female physicians in Britain in 1865, when Elizabeth Garrett Anderson qualified through a route that was immediately closed behind her by the examining body, which had not realised, when it admitted her, that the rules would allow it. She qualified anyway. The examining body changed its rules. She had already passed. That detail, the rule changed after she passed to prevent the next woman from using the same route, is its own small portrait of the Victorian establishment, always a step behind the women it was trying to contain, always adjusting the rules to close the door that had just been walked through. The door kept being walked through, the rules kept being adjusted, and the gap between the adjustment and the next door grew smaller, over time, as more women moved through more doors, and the institutional energy required to close each one behind them became harder to sustain. This is not a triumphant narrative. The progress was real but slow and costly and uneven, and many women paid prices that the history books do not record because the history books were not written about them. But the direction was clear, and the direction was made by the accumulated refusals, the small and large and private and public ones, of women who had decided that the drawing room was not enough. The candle on the dressing table, it has been burning for a very long time now. Since this morning, in the story we've been telling, through all the hours of the day that Victorian women navigated, with all the care and strategy and suppressed fury and quiet resourcefulness that the day required. It has been burning through all of that. It is very low now. But within the mainstream of Victorian medical practice, for women who had not yet been formally committed, for women who were simply difficult or nervous or showing signs of that broad spectrum emotional inconvenience that the era labelled hysteria, there was a first-line treatment, not institutionalization, something that looked, from the outside, like medicine. It was called the rest cure, and the man who invented it was a physician named Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. Mitchell was, by the standards of his era, a serious and respected man. He had served as a physician during the American Civil War, treating soldiers with severe nerve damage. He was published. He was credentialed. He moved in the upper reaches of Philadelphia society. He wore his authority by all accounts, with the comfortable ease of someone who had never seriously considered that he might be wrong. in the 1870s and 1880s, Mitchell developed a formal treatment protocol for women suffering from what he diagnosed as neurasthenia, a condition of nervous exhaustion, and from the broader category of hysteria. The treatment was specific and detailed. It had a name, it had a structure, and it had a prescribed duration. And here is where I need you to really listen, because what I'm about to describe is not an exaggeration. The rest cure required the patient, always a woman, in Mitchell's primary application of it, to be confined to bed for a period of 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes longer. During this time, she was forbidden from sitting up. She was forbidden from feeding herself. She was forbidden from reading. She was forbidden from writing. She was forbidden from seeing family members. She was cared for by a hired nurse who managed her physical needs and who was instructed to be pleasant but not stimulating. 6 to 8 weeks of enforced immobility, of intellectual erasure, of complete removal from the world she'd been living in, and complete surrender of her own agency over her own body. This was the cure. It was built on a specific theory, which was that nervous disorders in women were caused by excessive intellectual activity, that the female nervous system was, by its nature, more fragile than the male, and that when it was overstimulated, by reading, by writing, by thinking, by feeling too much, it broke down, which means the cure for the condition was the condition, or to put it another way, the treatment designed to address the suffering of women who were frustrated, isolated, and emotionally suppressed was to frustrate them further, isolate them completely, and suppress their emotional expression with medical authority. And patients who resisted, who refused the enforced rest, or who refused the diet, Mitchell prescribed a high-calorie feeding regimen, significant quantities of milk and raw eggs, intended to build up the supposedly depleted body, could be force-fed. This was not rare. It was documented. It was considered appropriate within the parameters of the treatment. The rest cure had a counterpart that I need to tell you about, because without it the full shape of what was happening doesn't come clear. For men. Men with the same diagnosis, men who presented with nervous exhaustion and emotional difficulty and the general signs of a system under strain, Dr. Mitchell did not prescribe bed rest. He prescribed the opposite. He called it the West Cure: fresh air, horseback riding, physical activity, outdoor life. The American West specifically, its openness, its physical demands, its bracing lack of the drawing room and the consulting room, and the world of obligation and performance. For women with nervous disorders, 6 to 8 weeks in bed, alone, in silence, not allowed to think. For men with nervous disorders, go west, ride horses, do hard physical things in the open air. Same diagnosis, opposite treatment, one cured by restriction, one cured by freedom. Mitchell did not appear to notice the contradiction, or if he did not find it troubling enough to mention in print. But the contradiction is worth holding for a moment, because it is so precise. The same physician, the same diagnosis, nervous exhaustion, the system under strain. Two completely opposite prescriptions. One designed to restore the patient by removing every demand. One designed to restore the patient by multiplying them. The logic that explains the difference is not medical, it is cultural. It rests on an assumption about the fundamental nature of men and women that is so deeply embedded in the Victorian medical world that it was invisible to the people operating within it. The assumption was this: men are active by nature. Their systems are energized by engagement, by physical challenge, by the demands of the external world. To cure a man's nervous exhaustion, you gave him more of what he was built for. just in a purer form, away from the complications of civilization. Women are passive by nature. Their systems are depleted by engagement, intellectual activity, creative work, emotional complexity. These are burdens that the female nervous system, by its constitution, cannot sustain without damage. To cure a woman's nervous exhaustion, you removed those burdens entirely. You returned her to the state of pure, uncomplicated, undemanding passivity that her nature supposedly required. The rest cure was not designed to heal a person. It was designed to return a woman to the state the ideology said she should have been in to begin with, which is why it made her worse. Gilman was not suffering from too much intellectual activity. She was suffering from not enough, from isolation, and from the particular despair of being denied the things that made her feel like herself. The rest cure prescribed 6 more weeks of exactly what had made her ill. This is the architecture of the suppression at its most clinical. Not cruelty, certainty. The absolute certainty of men who had built a theory of female nature that explained everything they observed, including the patient's protest, as evidence in support of the theory. A woman who said the rest cure was making her worse was exhibiting the very nervousness it was designed to treat. The system explained itself perfectly. It just wasn't describing reality. The rest cure was celebrated when it was introduced as a significant medical advance. It was adopted by physicians across the English-speaking world. It was prescribed to thousands of women over the following decades, and then one of those women wrote about it. Before I tell you about her, I want to give you a moment with the ordinary woman first, because Charlotte Perkins Gilman, whose name you are about to hear, was exceptional, and it matters to acknowledge that first, so that what her story reveals about the common experience becomes clear. For most women who underwent the rest cure, there was no writing about it afterward. There was no story made, no account given, no testimony preserved. They went into the treatment, they endured it. They came out, sometimes changed, sometimes quieter, sometimes functioning in the narrow way the treatment defined as recovery. And they went back to the drawing rooms, and the morning calls and the 3 draft letters, and they did not discuss it. Not because there was nothing to say, but because saying it was not permitted and never had been. Their experience exists only in the aggregate, in the numbers of admissions, in the general shape of what was prescribed, in the occasional letter that survived because it was never sent or was saved by a sister who understood. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's experience exists in full, and it matters enormously. She was born in 1860 in Hartford, Connecticut. By the time she was in her mid-20s, she had already established herself as a writer and thinker of considerable force. She had opinions, she wrote about them. She believed firmly in the importance of women's intellectual and economic independence at a time when this was a distinctly minority view. She married in 1884. A year later, she had a daughter. And shortly after the birth of her daughter, she became severely ill. What she experienced was, in the language of today, postpartum depression. What it was called then, and what it was treated as, was something else. She went to Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. Mitchell examined her. Mitchell listened to whatever he considered relevant, and Mitchell prescribed the rest cure. She was fed, she was bathed, she was kept in bed, she was not allowed to read, she was not allowed to write, she was not allowed to work or think or do any of the things that were, for her, the core of being herself. For a month she underwent the treatment, and at the end of it Mitchell sent her home with instructions. The instructions were specific. She was to live, as he put it, as domestic a life as possible. She was to spend no more than 2 hours a day in intellectual activity. She was to never touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as she lived. As long as she lived. The cure for a woman whose mind was too active was to give her mind away. Permanently. Not as a temporary measure. As a lifetime prescription. Gilman followed the instructions. For 3 months she tried to follow them, and she later wrote in precise and unflinching terms that those 3 months brought her, as she described it, so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that she could see it from where she was standing. She stopped following the instructions. She started writing again. She left her husband. She moved to California. She built, out of the pieces of her own refusal, a career as one of the most significant social theorists of her generation. And then, in 1892, she published a short story. It was called The Yellow Wallpaper. It is the account of a woman confined to a room by her physician husband, forbidden to write, who gradually loses her mind while staring at the pattern in the wallpaper. The story is first person, present tense, intimate, and deeply strange. It is one of the most uncomfortable pieces of fiction of the 19th century. It was not comfortable to write, and it was not comfortable to read, and that was entirely the point. She sent a copy to Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. He did not respond. By most accounts, he largely ignored it. His treatment protocol continued unchanged for years afterward. What Gilman said about why she wrote the story much later was this. She had not written it for literary reasons. She had written it to save other women from the treatment she'd undergone, to put into fiction what she couldn't put into argument, or petition, or polite request, because none of those channels were available to her. She used the only tool she had left after everything else had been taken away. She wrote. The story eventually found its audience. It is still in print. It is still read. It is still the first thing most people encounter when they begin to understand what the rest cure actually was and what it actually did. Mitchell died in 1914. The rest cure fell out of favour in the years around the turn of the century, as medicine slowly began to revise its theories about women, nerves, and the relationship between the two. The diagnosis of hysteria was officially removed from psychiatric classification in 1980, which tells you something, if you needed it, about how slowly these things move. Gilman had tried to change it by writing a story in 1892. It took medical science another 88 years to agree with her. Consider what that gap contains. 88 years is not an abstract period. It is the span of a human life. It is 2 full generations of women who were born into a world where the diagnosis of hysteria was a valid medical category, and who grew old and died in that same world, never having seen it officially recognized as the category error it was. In those 88 years, the rest cure fell out of fashion, but what replaced it was not always more honest. Different theories arrived, different vocabularies. The institutional tendency to interpret female distress as a symptom of female nature rather than as a response to female circumstances, that persisted. It changed its language. It kept the structure. There's something in that, in the gap between the story and the agreement, that I keep coming back to. The 88 years of confidence. The 88 years of prescribing what had been demonstrated not to work. The comfort, in medicine as in social life, of theories that confirmed what everyone already wanted to believe. But the rest cure was, in its way, merely the soft end of what Victorian society was willing to do to women who showed the wrong emotions. Because beneath the rest cure, beneath the weeks in bed, and the dietary protocols and the confiscation of the pen, there was something harder, something older, something with lawyers and courtrooms and locked doors, the law. In Britain and in much of America, the legal structure governing married women in the 19th century was built on a doctrine called coverture. The principle was simple, stated simply, and stunning in its implications. When a woman married, her legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She ceased to exist as a legal person. She could not own property in her own name, she could not sign contracts, she could not bring a lawsuit or defend against one, she could not control her own earnings, and, most relevantly for the story we're telling tonight, she could not, in many jurisdictions, be committed to an asylum without her husband's consent. But she could be committed with it, very easily, without her own consent, without a hearing, without any independent medical opinion that stood apart from the one provided by physicians friendly to the family. In Illinois, until 1867, the law was specific. A husband could commit his wife to an asylum without a public hearing, without a trial, without any legal process at all. Men who were to be committed required due process. They had rights, protections, the machinery of law working on their behalf. Married women did not. They were, in the eyes of that law, extensions of their husbands, not people of independent standing. And this is where a woman named Elizabeth Packard enters this story. Start here, with the ordinary woman again. Because Elizabeth Packard was not extraordinary in the way that Charlotte Perkins Gilman was extraordinary. As a writer, as a public intellectual, as someone with a platform. She was, before everything happened, a respectable middle-class wife and mother in Illinois, 6 children, a minister's wife, the kind of woman the Victorian world considered safely categorized. She had opinions. This was, as it turned out, a problem. Theophilus Packard was a Calvinist minister with firm religious views and a strong sense of his own authority. Elizabeth Packard had her own religious views, which diverged from her husband's in several significant ways, and she expressed them in her Sunday school class, in conversations at church, in the general manner of someone who considers having a mind a feature rather than an inconvenience. Her husband disagreed with her views. He then escalated. On the morning of June 18th, 1860, Elizabeth Packard was taken from her home. Her husband had arranged it. 2 physicians, both from his church, both known to him personally, had provided the necessary paperwork. A sheriff was present. There was no warning. There was no hearing. There was no opportunity for no hearing. There was no opportunity for Elizabeth to speak to a lawyer, or to contest the proceeding, or to say anything at all that would have the weight of legal consequence behind it. Under the 1851 Illinois statute, none of that was required. A husband's word accompanied by a physician's note was sufficient. She was a married woman. That was, in law, the relevant fact. She was taken to the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane in Jacksonville. She spent 3 years there. The records of her time inside suggest she was not passive. She continued to write, when she was permitted and sometimes when she wasn't. She continued to argue, to observe, to document. She wrote letters that were in some cases confiscated. She attempted, through whatever channels were available to her, to communicate with the outside world. What she was experiencing inside that institution was this. She was a sane woman in an asylum, surrounded by people whose authority to be there was, in her case, based entirely on the fact that her husband had disagreed with her. The institution had its own logic, of course. She was there because she was diagnosed. She was diagnosed because she had been committed. She had been committed because her husband had filed the paperwork. The circularity of this was complete. In 1863 she was released. Not because her case had been reviewed and found wanting. but because her husband had decided for his own reasons to release her. He then locked her in their home. She managed to get a note to a neighbour. The neighbour contacted a lawyer. A judge issued a writ of habeas corpus, a legal order requiring that a person be brought before a court to determine whether their detention is lawful. Elizabeth Packard was brought to court in January 1864. The question before the court was essentially, is this woman sane? The jury deliberated for 7 minutes. 7 minutes. To decide whether a woman who had been institutionalized for 3 years for holding inconvenient opinions was, in fact, mentally sound. They found her sane, unanimously, in 7 minutes. And then Elizabeth Packard did something that I find genuinely remarkable, and which sets her apart from almost anyone else in this story. She didn't go home and manage her anger in silence. She became a lobbyist. She wrote. She published. She petitioned. She testified before legislatures. She was, by every account, exhausting to those who tried to dismiss her, because she had learned in 3 years of being told her views didn't count exactly how much they did count when she used the right channels. In 1867, 3 years after her trial, the Illinois legislature passed what became known as Mrs. Packard's personal liberty law. The law guaranteed that anyone accused of insanity, including married women, was entitled to a jury trial before being committed. The automatic right of a husband to commit a wife, with no process and no review, was ended in Illinois. She didn't stop there. Over the following years, she helped change asylum commitment laws in several other states. She advocated for the rights of asylum inmates more broadly. She pushed for property rights for married women. She was, by the measure of what she actually achieved, one of the more effective legislative reformers of her era, all because a Calvinist minister in Illinois had found his wife's opinions inconvenient. There is something in Elizabeth Packard's story that I think is worth sitting with for a moment, not as an inspirational conclusion, but as a piece of information. The system that was designed to suppress her anger, to remove her voice, to make her legally invisible, it failed. Not immediately, not without enormous cost, but it failed. She outlasted it. That is not a comfortable story of triumph. It's a harder thing than that. It's a story about what it cost to push back, and how long it took, and how much had to be endured before the pushing worked. 3 years in an asylum, a husband who locked her in her house, 7 minutes of jury deliberation that should have taken about 7 seconds. But it worked, and the law changed. The coverture doctrine that had made all of this possible did not disappear overnight. It eroded slowly across the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th, as married women's property acts were passed in various jurisdictions, as the legal personhood of women began incrementally to be acknowledged. It was a long process, but it was a process. It moved. What's worth noting, and what gets lost in the broad sweep of Victorian history, is that the emotional suppression we've been tracing all evening was not experienced equally across the social spectrum. The angel in the house, the morning call, the rescue, the asylum commitment, these were, in a very specific sense, the problems of the middle and upper classes, because working-class women had a completely different relationship with all of it. Step out of the drawing room for a moment. Step off the respectable street. Step into the part of Victorian Britain that the etiquette manuals did not address, because they were not written for it. You are a factory girl in Manchester in 1865. You're up before 5. You're in the mill by 6. You're surrounded by noise so constant and so physical that it has long since stopped being something you hear and become something you simply inhabit. A condition of your body, like temperature. You work 10 hours, sometimes 12. You negotiate with a foreman who is not interested in your opinion, but who you have learned, over time, to manage anyway through a combination of efficiency, stubbornness, and the particular kind of authority that comes from being very good at what you do. You argue with the woman next to you about who has whose thread. You barter. You complain. You go home and you argue about the rent with your landlady, and you manage the money and you feed the children, and somewhere in all of it, in the middle of the noise and the negotiation and the constant physical labour, there is very little space for anyone to tell you that your emotions need to be managed into invisibility, because nobody expects you to be an angel in the house. You can't afford to be. The angel ideal was a luxury, or rather, it was a punishment disguised as a luxury. It was something you had to aspire to if you wanted to be considered respectable. And respectability, for the middle and upper classes, was the currency everything else ran on. For working class women, the currency was different. It was survival. It was wages and rent and children who ate enough, and getting through the week without catastrophe. The performance of emotional serenity was not only unaffordable, it was in the environment these women actually lived in, actively counterproductive. A woman who was too gentle, too deferential, too careful about the impression she made, she would be taken advantage of. She needed to be able to argue, to assert, to occupy space. And so she did, which created a different problem, because the same society that punished middle-class women for showing anger punished working-class women for, essentially, existing in public. The working-class woman who was vocal and assertive and occupied space was not described as hysterical. She was described as coarse, rough, lacking refinement. She was judged against the standard of the angel she couldn't possibly be, and found wanting, and the finding wanting was used to justify treating her as less deserving of protection, of respect, of the basic legal and social courtesies that a respectable woman received. The cruelty of it was elegant. Middle-class women were imprisoned by an ideal they were required to meet. Working-class women were condemned for an ideal they had no means to achieve. The ideal served in both cases to keep women in their place, just a different place. And yet, and this is the part that the history books don't always linger on, working-class women had something the angel in the house did not. They had voices, actual, audible, used in public ones. They could be angry out loud, not always safely, not without consequence. But the consequence was different in kind from what a middle-class woman faced. The market woman who lost her temper was not sent to a rescuer. The factory girl who argued with her foreman did not risk being committed to an asylum for domestic trouble. The outlet existed. The pressure had somewhere to go, and that difference between a world in which anger can be expressed, however imperfectly, and a world in which it cannot be expressed at all, is not a small one. It is the difference between a person who has room to breathe and a person who doesn't. The drawing rooms of Victorian England were, in their way, the most airless places in the empire, but the women in them, the women who sat very straight and kept their hands folded and drank their cold tea and wrote their 3-draft letters, they were not only enduring, some of them were also, quietly and with great ingenuity, building entirely parallel systems of communication. They were speaking in languages nobody official had agreed to translate, and those languages were more varied, more ingenious, and more durable than anyone who wasn't using them could easily have imagined. But before we trace them, there is one more piece of this social world that changes how the whole picture looks, there is one more dimension to the class story that deserves a moment before we leave it. Because the working-class woman who could argue in public, who could occupy space and be angry out loud, she also had something the middle-class woman often didn't: community. Not the community of morning calls and drawing-room visits, which was a performance of community rather than the thing itself. Real community. The kind that forms among people who share walls and alleyways and market mornings, and the kind of daily proximity that makes it impossible to maintain a performance for very long. In those communities, the emotional rules were different. A woman who was struggling, who was exhausted or frightened or furious about something real, did not have to convert it into 3-draft letters. She could say it to her neighbours, to the woman who shared her landing, to the group of women she worked alongside, who understood the specific quality of her particular difficulties because they were living with their own versions of the same thing. Women's networks among the working class were not simply practical arrangements. They were, in many communities, the primary social structure through which information, help and emotional support actually moved. The middle-class version of this, the carefully managed drawing-room call, the embroidered letter, was a pale and formal imitation of something that, in working-class communities, happened spontaneously, noisily, and without requiring a calling card. The quiet and the noise were not equal. The noise had something the quiet lacked. But back to the drawing room, back to the women who had no noise available to them, who had to find other means. The thing about a system designed to suppress expression is that it cannot suppress the impulse toward expression. It can redirect it. It can push it underground. It can make it smaller and quieter and less legible to the people who are not supposed to see it. But the impulse is always there, and Victorian women, confined by the elaborate architecture of respectability and medical authority and legal invisibility, they found ways. The most private was the diary. Not every Victorian woman kept one, but many did, and the ones that survive are remarkable documents. Not because they are dramatic, many of them are not, but because of what they contain beneath the surface. Historians who have studied Victorian women's private journals describe encountering, in some of them, a kind of double writing. The visible layer, the account of the day, the visitors received, the weather, the household details, and then underneath it something else. A pattern of pressure in the handwriting, phrases that don't quite connect to the surrounding text, passages that have been crossed out so thoroughly that the words beneath them are unrecoverable. One of the things you could do with a diary was write the first draft, the unsoftened one, the one you would never send and never say aloud, and then cross it out. And the crossing out itself, the fact of it, the evidence of something having been there and then obliterated, is its own kind of testimony. The anger existed, the diary knew, and the diary kept the secret while simultaneously proving it had one. Letters were more complicated because letters left the house. A letter to a trusted sister or close friend could carry more than its surface allowed, but it required a degree of trust that was not always available, and a correspondent skilled enough to read between the lines without it being stated. And yet the lines were there to be read. Historians of Victorian correspondence have noted that letters written by women to their closest correspondents sometimes carry, in the careful particularity of what they don't say, a complete account of what they are actually experiencing. The very precision of the omission is the message. The practiced eye can see it. There was also the language of stamps. The angle at which a postage stamp was placed on an envelope carried, in the Victorian era, a system of meaning that was widely understood among those who used it. A stamp placed upside down in the corner communicated something different from a stamp placed sideways. A stamp in a specific position could signal affection, urgency, or the fact that the letter contained something between its official lines. It was a small thing. It is almost charming considered from the outside, this elaborate semaphore of postage. But it existed because the official language was not available, and the pressure to communicate did not go away simply because the official channels were closed. And then there was fiction. Victoria's reign produced some of the greatest novels in the English language. It also produced in that literature an extraordinary concentration of female anger that could not be spoken directly, and so was spoken through character, through plot, through the particular intensity of certain scenes that seem, even now, to be carrying more weight than the story requires. Think about Jane Eyre. The opening, young Jane punished for fighting back against her cousin, locked in a red room that she is convinced is haunted. Charlotte wrote that scene. The trapped child, the punishment for defiance, the locked room, in 1847. She was writing from her own experience of constraint. The anger in the novel is not metaphorical, it is architectural, it is built into the structure of the book. Think about Middlemarch. Dorothea Brooke's extraordinary intelligence and energy, directed entirely inward because there is no outward channel available for it. George Eliot begins the novel with a prelude about St. Teresa of Avila, who found a great epic in which to spend herself. Dorothea does not. The novel is about what happens to a life like that. All that capability, pressing against a world with no space for it. These were not coincidences. These were women writing what they knew, using the only outlet available that was large enough to hold what they were carrying, and the readers understood. That is the other part of this. Victorian women read these novels in enormous numbers, and they were not reading them as escapism. They were reading them as testimony, as documentation that what they were feeling was real and had been felt by others, and had been seen clearly enough to be put into words, even if those words had to live inside a story. The candle on the dressing table is burned quite low by now. The room is quieter than it was this morning. The afternoon light has shifted. There is one final chapter to this story of suppressed anger and its many secret channels, the one that matters most. Because eventually, not for everyone, but for enough women, in enough places, at enough moments, the quiet stopped being sufficient. The codes were useful, the diaries were useful, the fiction was necessary. But none of it changed the conditions that made the anger necessary in the first place, and some women decided that this was no longer acceptable. The women's suffrage movement, which grew across the latter half of the 19th century and into the 20th, from a polite petition campaign into something that involved smashed windows and hunger strikes and prison, was, among other things, the moment when the anger that had been coded and redirected and pressed into diary pages and crossed out with such careful thoroughness, finally, definitively, came above ground. The suffragists are often discussed in terms of political history, voting rights, legal reform, the franchise, and those things matter enormously. But the emotional dimension of the movement is equally significant. These were women who had grown up in a world that told them their anger was a symptom of their own deficiency, who had spent their lives performing patience they did not feel for systems that did not deserve it, and who eventually decided, not all at once, not without argument and disagreement among themselves, that they had been patient for long enough. The anger came out, loudly, publicly, with consequences that were real and sometimes severe. Women were imprisoned for it, force-fed when they hunger-struck, subjected to the kind of physical coercion that the rest cure had always been a gentler version of, but they were not committed to asylums for holding inconvenient opinions. They were not diagnosed with hysteria for expressing views in public. The machinery that had been designed to make female anger invisible was, by the early 20th century, visibly creaking under the weight of women who had decided not to cooperate with it. It did not collapse all at once. These things never do. But it had begun to give. And in the meantime, in the decades before it gave, in the drawing rooms and the morning calls and the carefully managed silences, something else had been happening. Something slower and less dramatic and less documented and possibly more important. Women had been talking to each other, not in the official language, in the other one. The language of the crossed-out sentence and the particular angle of the stamp and the third draft of the letter that said nothing but meant everything. The language that needed no official translator because its speakers had always understood it perfectly. They had always known, and the ways they preserved that knowing, the specific, material, physical ways, are worth understanding, because they are not abstractions, they are objects, real ones, that still exist in archives and libraries and private collections, and that tell a story that the official record of Victorian life does not. The Victorian diary, for a middle-class woman, was often a particular kind of object. Small, leather-bound sometimes, fitted to a coat pocket or to the drawer of a writing desk. The kind of thing that could be closed quickly and slipped out of sight. The kind that, if found, could be explained away. A household accounts book, a calendar of visitors, a record of the weather. The contents in many cases were exactly that on the surface. Visitor lists, menu plans, the weather. Mrs. Somebody called on Thursday. The children had their music lesson. And then, in the margins, in the spaces between the official entries, in the back pages that were theoretically blank, or in a second, smaller notebook kept separately, in a place that required knowing where to look, the private writing. It is extraordinary as a body of material when you consider what it was produced under. The woman writing it knew, in most cases, that discovery was a real possibility. She knew that what she was writing could be used against her, not legally, perhaps, but socially, domestically, in the currencies that mattered in her world. She wrote it anyway, because not writing it was its own kind of loss. The pressure needed somewhere to go. What the private writing contains, across thousands of diaries from the Victorian era, is the texture of real experience, not the performed version, the actual one. The grief that was described in public as bearing up so well, and in private as something that came in waves, at unexpected moments, in the middle of making the household arrangements. The boredom, the particular Victorian female boredom, which was not laziness but the specific exhaustion of an active mind with nowhere adequate to direct itself. The fury, the resentment, the love, too. Genuinely, the love and the warmth and the moments of real pleasure that the performance didn't entirely suppress. The full range of human emotion, documented in small handwriting, in the private object that was the only place it was safe to be real. Historians who work with these documents describe a consistent quality in reading them. A sense of recognition that crosses the distance of 150 years. The particular way a Victorian woman writes about a conversation that went wrong, the precision of the feeling, the specific quality of the self-examination afterward, the wondering whether it had been her fault, and the countervailing knowledge that it had not been, and the careful way she holds both of those things at once. These are not foreign experiences. They are not exotic or historical in any distancing way. They are immediate, familiar. You know this. You've had the conversation that went wrong and examined it afterward at 11 o'clock at night, going over the words and the tone and the possible interpretations. This is not a Victorian experience. This is a human one. The diary knew. The letter networks were more complicated and more fascinating because letters were not private. They were, by their nature, documents that moved between people. They required a correspondent. And what they required of a correspondent was a particular kind of literacy, not reading literacy. Everyone the letter was addressed to could read. A different kind. The literacy of the unsaid. The ability to read a carefully constructed surface and know what was underneath it. Not because the underneath was coded in any technical way, but because the correspondent was someone who lived in the same world, navigated the same constraints, and understood, from the inside, how a woman would phrase something she couldn't say directly. The trusted correspondent was a specific relationship. She was the person to whom the third draft, and sometimes the first draft, could be sent. The person with whom you did not need to perform. The person who had her own first drafts and her own crossed-out pages, and who received your carefulness as the signal it was. These relationships were maintained, in some cases, across decades and enormous physical distances. Letters went between women who had grown up together and then married into different counties, different countries. The correspondence sustained something that geography had interrupted, the specific intimacy of being known. And within that intimacy, the real conversation could happen. There were also, in Victorian England and America, formal and semi-formal women's reading groups and literary societies. These occupied a slightly different space. They were public enough to have meeting schedules and membership, but private enough, in their all-female composition, to allow a degree of directness that mixed company conversation did not. In these groups, women read and discussed novels, poetry, history, and increasingly, as the century progressed, political and social theory. They debated, they disagreed, they formed and expressed opinions about things that were happening in the world in language that could be considerably more direct than anything they could use in a drawing room with men present. These societies were not radical. Most of them were entirely respectable in their stated purposes and their membership. But they were, in practice, spaces in which intellectual life could happen openly, where a woman could say, "I thought the author was wrong about this," without the social consequences that the same statement would carry in a mixed context. They were the official version of what the private letter had always been doing informally. And what moved through both, through the letters and the diaries and the reading groups and the marginalia penciled into borrowed books, was not just information. It was a particular kind of sustenance, the sustenance of being believed, of being taken seriously, of having your response to your experience treated as a legitimate response, rather than as a symptom. This is the thing that the Victorian suppression system could not ultimately contain. It could prevent public expression. It could medicalize and legally remove the most visible dissenters. It could enforce, through social consequence and institutional authority, a very thorough performance of emotional compliance, but it could not prevent women from knowing. It could not reach inside the private writing and erase it. It could not follow the letter to its destination and prevent the trusted correspondent from reading between the lines. It could not enter the reading circle and stop the discussion that happened in the space between the text and the reader. The inner life was always out of reach, and that inner life accumulated across generations, passed in fragments, from mother to daughter, from friend to friend, from the novel to the reader who recognized herself in it, became a kind of inheritance, not a formal one, not documented, not catalogued or transferred with legal ceremony, but real. You are the recipient of some version of it, whether you know it or not. The assumptions you carry about what your own feelings are worth, that they are real, that they are yours, that they do not require official endorsement to count. Those assumptions did not arrive fully formed. They were built over generations by women who had less access to them than you do, and who used what they had to make more. The diaries, the letters, the reading circles, the novels full of anger that couldn't speak its own name, the 7-minute verdict and the law that followed it, the story written in 1892 and sent to the doctor who didn't answer. Each one was a small act of insistence, an insistence that the interior mattered, that the experience was real, that the feeling was not a symptom. And across enough time and enough such insistences, the world shifted. Not fast, never fast, but it shifted. And the women who made it shift were not for the most part the ones whose names ended up in the history books. They were the ones who wrote the diary entry and crossed it out, who sent the third draft letter with the understanding safely encoded in it. Who found, in a reading circle on a Tuesday afternoon, that someone else had felt the thing they had felt, and that this, the simple fact of not being alone in it, was enough to make it slightly more bearable. The collective nature of that inheritance is something worth sitting with, because the Victorian suppression of female anger did not fail, because one woman refused loudly enough to make everyone change their minds. It failed, insofar as it failed, because enough women, across enough decades, maintained enough interior truth to pass something forward. Each generation received what the previous one had preserved and added to it what they could. What they could, within the constraints available. The daughter who read the novel her mother had kept. The granddaughter who found the diary with the crossed-out pages and understood, from the quality of the crossing out, what had been there. The woman who read the Yellow Wallpaper in 1892 and recognized the room. The woman who read it again, reprinted in 1973, and still recognized the room. The room is still recognizable. That is the thing, the specific quality of feeling that the Victorian suppression was designed to contain. The feeling of being told your experience is not what you think it is, that your response is a symptom, that your anger is a problem of your own making. That feeling did not disappear with the diagnosis of hysteria in 1980. It became subtler, it changed its vocabulary, but the structure of it persisted, and the antidote to it, the thing that the diaries and the letters and the reading circles and the trusted correspondence were providing in their various ways, that too persisted. The antidote was recognition, the experience of having your interior acknowledged as real, of being believed. That is what the underground language was always carrying, not complaint, not primarily anger, though the anger was real and present and justified. The primary content of what moved through the trusted letter and the crossed-out diary and the glance across the drawing room was, I see what you're carrying. I believe it is real. You're not alone in it. You have felt this. Some version of it. The particular recognition of meeting someone who knows something you know, without either of you having said it. The relief of it. the way it makes the weight slightly more bearable even if it doesn't make it lighter. Victorian women felt this too, across the embroidery frames and the calling cards and the carefully arranged drawing rooms. The knowledge moved between them, in the third draft of the letter, in the angle of the stamp, in the crossed-out page of the diary that was meant to be private but somehow became, across the generations, a kind of testimony. We still have those diaries. We still have those letters. Historians read them, and archaeologists of the ordinary restore what was crossed out, and the words come back, not always, but sometimes, partial, damaged, real. And when they come back, what they say is usually not dramatic. It is usually just, this is what it was like. This is what I carried. This is what I knew, and could not say, and wrote down anyway in the one place that was mine. That is enough. It has always been enough. The women who lived inside that system, who sat very straight and kept their hands very still and said the right things at the morning calls and raised children who would grow up to do the same, they were not passive. They were people navigating an extraordinary set of constraints with the tools available to them. Some of them navigated it with grace, some with bitterness, some with a kind of quiet resourcefulness that is genuinely remarkable when you look at it clearly. And some of them did not navigate it at all. Some of them broke under it, or were broken by it, or disappeared inside the institutions designed to contain them. Their names are mostly lost. Their stories exist, if at all, in the aggregate numbers of female asylum admissions, in the records of rest cures administered, and morning calls managed, and letters that were never sent. But they were there. They were real, and their anger was real. It was always real, and I want to stay with that reality for a moment, before we move into the quiet, because the numbers, the asylum admissions, the rest cures administered, the women for whom the machinery of suppression worked exactly as intended, those numbers have a texture that the statistics alone don't convey. Think about what it meant to actually be inside the rest cure, not the theory of it, not the medical literature describing it in confident professional language, the actual experience of being a woman lying in a room for 6 weeks, alone, with a nurse who had been instructed to be pleasant but not stimulating. Who managed your physical needs, brought you food, helped you to the washroom, changed the linen, with the brisk efficiency of someone doing a job well, which is a completely different thing from the warmth of someone who knows you. No reading, that's easy to say. It's harder to feel as a person for whom reading is one of the primary ways of making sense of the world, of not being entirely alone inside your own head. The absence of it is not like the absence of a luxury. It is like the removal of a tool, a necessary one. No writing, no way to put things in order on paper, no way to find out what you think by watching the words arrive, no way to do the thing that, for someone like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, was inseparable from the act of being conscious at all. No family, no visitors who could offer the specific comfort of being known. The nurse was pleasant. The nurse was not your sister. 6 weeks. The medical theory said this was healing. The theory said that the female nervous system was like an overstretched elastic, that if you removed all demand from it, it would return to its natural tension. Rest, restore, recover. What the theory did not account for was that the things being removed were not demands. They were the person. The reading, the writing, the conversation, the connection. These were not drains on the self. They were the self. And when you remove them all simultaneously for 6 weeks, with medical authority and a pleasant nurse, and no one to tell otherwise, the self does not rest. It begins to come apart at the edges, Gilman said she came near the borderline of utter mental ruin. She was precise about this. Not dramatic. Precise. She was a precise woman, and she described what she experienced precisely, which is exactly why her account is so difficult to dismiss. The borderline of utter mental ruin, 6 weeks into the cure for her nervous disorder. The cure made her worse, and when she finally stopped following the instructions, when she picked up a pen and began writing again, she began to recover. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes from surviving something designed to break you. You learn from the inside how the thing was built, what it was made of, where the weight rested. Gilman knew, and Elizabeth Packard across the 3 years she spent in Jacksonville. She was also learning, not the same lesson, a slightly different one. Because Packard was not unwell in the way that Gilman was unwell. Gilman had experienced a genuine medical crisis, a real and serious depression, postpartum in origin. The rest cure made it worse, but there was a real illness that preceded it. Packard was not ill. Packard was in disagreement with her husband. The distinction is not subtle, but within the institution the distinction did not matter. She was there. She was female. She had been committed by the correct procedure. The institution received her and processed her with the same bureaucratic calm it applied to everyone else. She spent 3 years in a building full of people with genuine mental illness, surrounded by suffering she had not come there with and could not leave behind. She watched. She documented. She was not passive. She continued to write when she could, to observe, to think. But the conditions of her thinking were not the conditions of a free person. She was housed. She was fed. She was not believed. For 3 years she was not believed. The habeas corpus trial in 1864 lasted only a few days. The jury took 7 minutes. But those 7 minutes came after 3 years of living in a world that had decided, officially and institutionally, that her perceptions of her own experience were not to be trusted, that her account of what had happened to her was, by definition, the account of someone whose account could not be trusted. 7 minutes is a very short time to restore 3 years. But they did, and she used what came after them. The women who chose to comply, and most did, because the alternative was so costly, developed their own forms of interior life that the compliance could not reach. This is the part that gets lost when we talk about Victorian women as simply constrained or simply suffering. They were that, and they were also people with full interior lives that the system around them had no access to. A woman could sit in a drawing room, perfectly still, perfectly composed, maintaining the appearance that the social world required, and simultaneously be entirely somewhere else. The needlework moved, the conversation happened, the tea was drunk, and somewhere behind all of it, a mind was running, over memories, over ideas, over the particular problem she'd been turning over for the past 3 days, over the novel she'd read twice because it said something she couldn't find any other way to hear. The compliance of the exterior and the freedom of the interior were not the same thing. The system controlled the outside. It could not control the inside. And this was the thing that made the diary so important, and the trusted letter, and the novel, because they were the bridges between the interior and the exterior, the places where the inside was allowed, briefly and carefully, to become visible, not to everyone, to the right person, in the right moment. The right person was often another woman. This is the part of Victorian women's history that I find consistently underestimated. The intellectual life that existed in those drawing rooms, among those women, in the forms available to it. The conversations that happened when the men had gone for their port, and the women were alone together for a short while. The letters exchanged between women of comparable intelligence who had, between them, the equivalent of a small university's worth of reading and thinking and forming of views that had nowhere official to go, and so went to each other. Mary Ann Evans, who published under the name George Eliot, because she knew her work would be taken more seriously if people believed it had been written by a man, was part of one of the most intellectually vibrant circles in Victorian England. She corresponded with philosophers and scientists and social theorists. She was, by any measure, one of the most significant thinkers of her generation. She published under a man's name, not because she was ashamed of what she'd written, because she understood the system she was operating in, and she made a calculation. The work mattered more than the name. The name was a tool. She used it. But the readers who read Middlemarch, who read The Mill on the Floss, who encountered in Dorothea Brooke and Maggie Tulliver and Gwendolen Harleth the particular quality of a life pressing against its own constraints, those readers often knew. They recognized the territory. They had lived in it. The novels of the Victorian era were, among other things, a vast encoded conversation among women about what it was like to be women, written in plain sight, reviewed by male critics, celebrated in drawing rooms, and carrying, in the spaces between the plot and the characters and the particular way certain scenes were lit, a message that went directly to the reader who needed it. I know what this is like. I have seen what you see. You're not imagining it. It is real. The anger was real. And the suffragists, the women who eventually decided that the encoded conversation was no longer enough, that the diary and the novel and the stamp at a particular angle had achieved something, but not enough, and that something more direct was required. They too were carrying a weight of accumulated, unacknowledged, legitimate fury. It had been building for a long time, across generations, deposited like sediment in the crossed-out pages and the three-draft letters and the evenings with the needlework and the thoughts moving like weather behind glass. By the time the first suffragist marched or smashed a window or chained herself to a railing or went on hunger strike in a prison cell, she was not only angry on her own behalf, she was angry on behalf of all the women who had learned, carefully and from their mothers, to convert their anger into patience, who had sat very straight in drawing rooms for decades, who had written the unsoftened draft and then crossed it out. The fury was ancestral. It had been accumulating since at least 1854, since the poem that wasn't a manifesto became a prescription, since the wandering womb gave way to the 75 symptoms, since the Illinois statute of 1851 made it legal for a man to disappear his wife without a hearing. And now it was in the street. Not all of it expressed the same way. The suffragist movement was not monolithic. It had factions and disagreements and serious arguments about strategy and tactics that its participants took very seriously. Some believed in constitutional methods. Some believed that constitutional methods had been given every possible chance and had failed, and that something louder was required. But across all of it, across the marches and the petitions and the arrests and the force-feeding and the long, grinding work of convincing a legal and political system to change, there was a thread of emotional truth that ran through everything. These women knew what they were feeling. They had always known. They had simply, finally, decided to say it where someone official could hear it. That decision cost many of them enormously. Prison, physical harm, social destruction, the loss of relationships with people they loved who did not agree with their choices, the particular pain of being told once again that their anger was a symptom of something wrong with them, This time not hysteria, but militancy, extremism, unladylike behaviour. The vocabulary changed, the structure remained. But the structure was cracking. It had been cracking since Elizabeth Packard passed her note through a window, since Charlotte Perkins Gilman put the pen back in her hand, and it cracked further and further, and the women who came after did not have to navigate quite the same walls, or quite the same institutions, or quite the same laws. Not because the world had suddenly decided to be just, but because enough women, in enough moments, had made the cracks. That is what all of it was. From the poem in 1854 to the 7-minute verdict in 1864, to the story published in 1892 and sent to the doctor who ignored it, the cracks, the ones that didn't look like much at the time and accumulated into something that changed the shape of the world. The anger did that. The real, legitimate, always present anger that the Victorian world spent so much time and institutional resource trying to make invisible. It was always there. It was always real. It is late now. The house has gone very quiet. That particular quality of quiet that settles in when the world outside has slowed, and the only sounds left are the ones that were always there. The small sounds, the settling sounds, the sounds of a building breathing in the dark. The evening is almost over. Let it settle gently. Everything you've heard tonight. The drawing room in 1873. The poem that became a prescription. The diagnosis with 75 symptoms. The doctor who prescribed freedom for men and silence for women. The woman who spent 3 years in an asylum and then changed the law, the crossed-out diaries, the stamps at particular angles, the novels full of a fury that had nowhere else to go. What all of it adds up to is something simpler than it sounds. Women have always felt things, every inconvenient thing, every righteous, complicated, difficult thing. The systems that tried to convince them otherwise, that their anger was a symptom, that their frustration was a medical condition, that their defiance was a legal problem to be managed, those systems were wrong. They were often confidently, authoritatively, institutionally wrong, and the women knew it. They wrote it down, in the one place where it was safe to write it. They said it to each other, in the language they'd built when the official one wasn't available. They always knew. You're in the quiet now, your own quiet. Let the drawing room fade. Let the morning calls and the etiquette manuals and the hushed and carefully managed dining rooms of Victorian England recede into the distance where history lives, still present, still worth knowing, but no longer urgent. No longer the first thing. Feel the weight of the bed beneath you, the particular way the blanket settles, the temperature of the room around you, which is exactly right, the sounds of the house, which are the sounds that mean you are safe and still and where you're supposed to be. Your breath is already slowing. It has been slowing for a little while now, without you having to tell it to. The candle on the dressing table is very low, just the smallest flame now, steady, not reaching for anything, simply burning quietly, in the particular way that small flames burn when the house is still and there is no wind and nothing is asking anything of them. The room around it is dark, the kind of dark that is comfortable rather than empty, warm dark, the dark of a room that has been lived in and thought in and felt in and is now, very slowly, at rest. You are in that room. The women we talked about tonight, they are in it too in a way, not urgently, not demandingly, just present in the quiet way that history is present, when you've spent time with it and let it settle into something real. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who wrote in the one space that was hers. Elizabeth Packard, who passed a note through a window and then changed the law. The unnamed woman in the drawing room in 1873 sitting very straight, with her cold tea and her folded hands and the thing behind the smile that she was still carrying. They are not asking anything of you right now. They are simply here. The candle is nearly gone. The flame is small now, very still. It barely moves. The room is warm. Your breath is easy and slow. The women knew. You know. The candle burns. Let it. Let everything go quiet. The flame is small and steady and still, and the room is warm, and you are safe, and it is enough.